Before we hop into this episode, I have one favor to ask of you. If you've got any kind of information or inspiration from this podcast, it would mean the world to me if you hit the subscribe button. Just like most podcasts out there are more people that watch this show that are not subscribed than that are subscribed. And so if you want to help me get bigger and better guests for this show as we go along, and I hope you do stick along, it would mean the world to me to hit that subscribe button so that we can make it happen. Thank you. Let's get into the interview. Psychotherapist, international bestselling author, TEDx speaker, keynote speaker, and the only other person that I know that lives on a sailboat other than Dr. John DeMartini. Amy Morin, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's rare to hear that somebody has ever heard of anybody who lives on a sailboat. So very cool.
Yeah, it is. It is. It seems like a profound way of living and one that you've carved out for yourself. And I'm excited to dive into your journey and the work that you put out into the world because I find it so valuable and stuff that I wish we were taught in school, truthfully. For you, working with clients and working with companies and everything in between, how much of a role do you think beliefs play in mental strength?
Oh, that's big because if you believe the world is an awful place, like I guarantee you will live your life in a way that makes it so. Or if you believe that other people aren't trustworthy or that they're all bad, you're going to do things that will reinforce that belief. And then the beliefs about ourselves. If I think I'm a incapable, incompetent person, then I won't put myself out there and do the things that would prove otherwise.
Mhm.
So it's huge. And we don't really recognize our own beliefs because it's something that we learn in childhood and we grew up with that. And it's tough to then unlearn this something that we've held near and dear to us for so many years. And these things that we think are absolute facts often aren't. But it's
Yeah.
tough to do that. It's tough to say, ooh, maybe I just lived the last 20, 30, 40 years of my life believing something that isn't necessarily true. But when we're open to learning and we're open to thinking, maybe things aren't exactly the way I see, like the entire journey changes. We can then become people we didn't think we could, and we can do things we never thought we were capable of doing.
Yeah, it is something that if it's invisible. And so it's difficult to say, okay, let me change my beliefs because I feel for most of us, we go throughout our lives not even aware of how our beliefs shape our reality. And when I became aware of that, it was like this eye-opening experience of there is so much that I can change that I felt I had no ability to change in my life. And even to go down to loss, because you experienced that a lot in your 20s. For me, it was a lot from like 5 to like 12. I lost three of the most important men in my life, my father, uncle, and grandfather. And for so long, it felt like life was happening to me until I realized I could change that belief and see it as life is happening for me. But we're not really taught that. So for you, like, what do you feel when clients come to you? Do you find that a lot of them are open to changing their beliefs, or do you think they have a lot of pushback in the beginning?
Yeah, there's a lot of pushback because people will say, yeah, but this is my life experience. And I'm not going to argue that that was your life experience. Like in your case, James, you lost people that were really close to you. So I'm sure it just felt like that's what life is, just people
Right.
dropping around me and disappearing from my life. And that's true, but that doesn't mean that life is awful and scary and horrible and that we should just wait for the other shoe to drop. And so it's difficult for people to unlearn something. And even in my own life, as I've helped people unlearn certain things that they've held true for a long time, there's still been things that I keep learning about myself. I had grown up and I was kind of a chubby kid and was always told it's genetic. Like you will never meant to be a thin person. And I lost weight as a teenager and an older young adult. And then years ago, I did this other thing where I did like this 30-day six-pack ab challenge just to see if you could get six-pack abs in 30 days. And my trainer was like, you've gotten the best results I've seen from almost anybody. And I said, why do you think that is? And he's like, well, to be honest, part of it's genetics. You have really good genes. And I thought, wow, I have literally spent my whole life like thinking that my genetics were working against me. And here's somebody saying, actually, we could credit your hard work for part of this, but part of it's also just going to be the fact that you have great genetics. And I thought, that's interesting that even though I'm talking to other people about undoing their beliefs, there's still certain things that I've held true where I grew up incredibly shy, thinking I didn't have anything valuable to say to anybody, rarely spoke, never raised my hand, and my friends and family mostly spoke for me. I would have never believed that, yeah, I will grow up and I'll become a podcaster and a public speaker and I'll write books and do all of these other things. Like never would have thought that was in the cards for me because I believed I was just not somebody who could publicly speak. But it's like, yes, and I was actually making that true about myself. And there's so many things like that if we don't challenge those things that we've held near and dear to us, we'll never know the difference.
Yeah, it's the challenging of things that I think is really, really important. And obviously in therapy, you're challenging a lot of people to question their own beliefs, question the way that they think about things. Are there questions that are just things that you often ask, you find yourself asking often to clients to help them kind of get out of that thinking, that limited perspective on things?
Yeah, so sometimes we'll just talk about like what are your general beliefs about other people. And sometimes people will be like, well, people are just kind of lazy these days. They're not cooperative, they're not trustworthy. And so it's like, well, where did those experiences come from? And if you were to move across the country, do you think that would also be your experience in a completely different town? Or, yeah, absolutely. And then we'll contrast that with somebody who says, people are incredibly kind and generous and giving. Well, if that person moved across the country, do you think they'd have that same experience? The answer is yes. So we just talk about that and how our behavior impacts that, right? Like if somebody walks into a meeting thinking these people are completely unfriendly and they're not going to talk to me, you sit in the corner and you don't talk to anybody and you leave like, yep, I knew they weren't friendly. So in the therapy office, we find ways to challenge some of the beliefs that people have. We uncover the beliefs with some questions about what do you generally believe about yourself and about other people in the world. And then let's do some behavioral experiments and test those theories and see if we can find some exceptions to the rule. Sometimes when maybe somebody was nice, or are there times when maybe if you acted differently, we could create a different outcome? I don't know, but we won't know until we try. And then we work on finding experiments to test their theories.
Yeah. You grew up in believing that you were going to go down the health field. You had some conversations with your sister, and it put you down the path that you're down today. And obviously, from the experience of writing the 13 reasons to begin with, was like the thing that blew everything up, and you didn't expect that to happen. So when that did happen, and then your life kind of put down this opportunity to speak with a publisher, write your first book, and then everything just like it seemed like it happened really quick. How did that change your belief around what you thought was possible for yourself?
Oh, that's a good question. So I was a therapist in rural Maine, and I only started freelance writing because my husband died when I was 26 and I needed extra income. You can only work as a therapist so many hours a week.
Yeah.
And I needed to pay the bills if I wanted to keep my house. So I started writing to earn a little bit of extra money. And it wasn't until my father-in-law was diagnosed with cancer. I had lost my mother, and my husband at that point, and now I was about to lose my father-in-law. Wrote the article, 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do. Originally, it was a letter to myself, and I found it helpful. So I thought, it helps me. Maybe it would help somebody else. So I published it online, and I thought, like, 50 people will read it, but 50 million people read it. One of those people was a literary agent who said, you should write a book. And she emailed me. But by then, like literally CNN in Mexico had called and MTV in Finland. Didn't even know what a literary agent was. So I kind of didn't respond to her very timely. And she reached out again and said, no, you really need to write a book. And it's not really something that had been on my radar. And I remember saying, like, I don't know how to write a book. I'm a therapist in rural Maine. And she was like, no, you could write a book. Within a month, we had multiple offers from publishers, which I know is somebody's dream come true. And then they wanted the book to come out within about 3 months of the time that I got the deal. So suddenly I was working as a therapist during the day and writing a book at night. And I remember writing it, just wondering, like, is anybody going to read this book? And still struggling with my own beliefs about whether I was capable enough to write a book, whether I could put something out into the planet. I didn't question if I could meet the deadline, which now that I've written 6 books, if somebody said I want a book in 30 days, I'd question that. But I didn't question my ability to do that. I just questioned, like, if I could create something that would be good enough that it would have value to other people. But it was based on the article that 50 million people read. So, and yet I still had doubts that anybody would be interested in the book. So, yeah, again, even as I'm talking to other people about getting rid of their beliefs, like I can identify plenty of times in my life where I've had beliefs, but fortunately I was willing to challenge that belief and said, well, I'm not out anything. If I write a book and nobody buys a copy, then like that's okay. That's not the worst thing in the world. So I did it anyway. And to be honest, when the book came out, it didn't instantly hit the bestsellers list. It was like a year and a half into the book already being on the shelf that it finally started hitting bestseller lists. It took a while for it to get there. But it did. And then it's been 10 years now that I've been able to keep writing and speaking about this topic because people keep showing that they are interested and that they want to know more about mental strength.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's funny because now you're at the point where I bet you get a lot of feedback of just like you don't even have to know what the next book is going to be because it's a series at this point of just a bunch of different things. Next it's gonna be teens and everything in between. Like you have so many people coming to you with feedback. For you, because I find with most of the authors that I speak to on this podcast is they write the book obviously for themselves to begin with and hopefully to provide value from others. But at the same time, the book that they get the most from isn't the one that they read, but it's the one that they write. And I'm curious for you, out of all the books that you've written so far, what book has taught you the most about yourself?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably the first book. I've written one for parents
Yeah.
and I wrote one for women and one for couples, but I think it was the first book that really just reminded me that, okay, even though I am a therapist and I talk about these things, it's things I still struggle with. We still all feel sorry for ourselves sometimes. In fact, that's why that one was number one on my list because I was in the midst of
Yeah.
feeling sorry for myself when I wrote the list. But I think yeah, and even to this day, I'll still find myself doing a lot of the things on that list, and now I have these powerful reminders of and I don't have to do that. I have choices.
Yeah. When I think of mental strength, I think a lot of people there's a hell of a lot of misconceptions about mental strength to begin with. And so I want to know because there's three core parts of mental strength that you speak about. When it comes to beliefs, because I think diving into the belief aspect is really what I love to talk about in this podcast. I get really excited about it because it's something that I wish we were taught in school that we just have no knowledge of if we don't learn stuff like from your books and others. What do people need to know about how our beliefs shape the three parts of mental strength?
So mental strength's about the way you think, feel, and behave. And of course, behind all of that are your underlying core beliefs about yourself. So if I believe I'm not a good enough person, then my thoughts are always going to point back to that. So if I get an
Mm,
email from a boss who says, let's meet tomorrow, and I believe I'm not a good enough person, my automatic thought is going to be, I'm about to get fired. I've messed up. I'm going to get in trouble tomorrow. And I have lots of thoughts around that, which then affects how I feel, which is then I'm going to be anxious and perhaps I'm already going to be sad because I'm imagining I'm about to be unemployed. And then what do I
right.
do? Maybe I spend the rest of the day just perseverating on all of the mistakes I've made that my boss is going to bring up tomorrow. Or maybe I already start looking for a new job or I call all my friends and family and tell them about I'm about to lose my job tomorrow. And then
Mm,
what happens? Well, then my belief again that I'm not good enough just keeps getting reinforced as I keep dwelling on all of these things. And then if I go in tomorrow, and even if my boss says, hey, I just wanted to talk to you about that project due next month, and it's none of those things that I had imagined, in the back of my head, I'm still like, yeah, but I'm not good enough. And perhaps I skated by today and you didn't notice it or you didn't bring it up. But what about next time? And that can just get so perpetuated in our lives where we see everything through that lens. Or again, if I believe that other people are always bad, I'm always going to be on the lookout for when people make a mistake or they mess up, or if somebody's 10 minutes late to a meeting, it's because they don't care and they're rude, as opposed to maybe they care so much about their job that they got caught up in something. And I don't give them the benefit of the doubt. And then when they do something nice, I always think, well, they had ulterior motives or they were just doing it to make me look bad. And then these beliefs just keep getting reinforced over and over. So you have to be open to the idea that maybe, just maybe, there's some exceptions to the rule. There are times when all of those things aren't true. And then you start chipping away at those beliefs just a little bit at a time. Sometimes by changing the way you think, by being open to thinking differently. Sometimes it's about changing your behavior. And sometimes it's about managing those emotions, about knowing, okay, I'm nervous that something bad's going to happen, but what can I do with that feeling today? I don't have to just pace back and forth and think about all the worst case scenarios. Maybe I call a friend and go out for coffee and talk about something completely different. Or maybe I go outside and go for a run today. And when we are open to that idea, then it really helps us figure out like, how do I want to live my life and how do I want to spend my time and what do I want to be true about the world and how do I manage that?
that's a good question. What do I want to be true? Yeah, I think for a lot of people, self-fulfilling prophecies seem to be common because of
Yeah.
what you just stated, like that entire idea. And I assume for you, it's when people are talking about their problems, it just becomes even more difficult because they're recreating it. When it comes to making change in people's lives, do you find it's easier to make change from a belief standpoint or a behavior standpoint? Because belief drives behavior, but behavior also drives belief.
That's a great question, and it kind of depends on the situation. So sometimes people are so stuck in the idea that something isn't going to work that they won't even begin to consider doing something differently. So we might have to
Right.
challenge it from that angle. At other times, people are like, oh, I'm not really convinced that this is going to work, but I'll do it. And they at least do it with an open enough mind. Because if somebody says, fine, Amy, I'll go to that support group that you're recommending, but it's going to be awful, and they are 100% convinced that it is not gonna be helpful, well, then it usually isn't, because they sit in the back corner, they don't talk to anybody, and they just sit there thinking about how awful it is. So, we might have to have some conversations, like, what if you walked in the door believing that maybe, just maybe, I'll take one thing away from this meeting? How might you act differently than if you went in there with the attitude that nothing is gonna work? So, sometimes we start with the conversation just to make sure somebody's open-minded enough that if they're going to take the action, that they don't sabotage themselves, because otherwise, I've had so many people who are like, "Nope, that's not gonna work," and they kinda put in an effort, but it's more like a half-hearted effort just to prove, "I told you that's not gonna work," and then it just
Mhm.
reinforces that belief. So we wanna make sure somebody goes into it knowing that, I'm not convinced that this is gonna work, but I'm open-minded enough that if it does, I'm willing to have my eyes open and recognize it.
Yeah. Out of the 13 from your first book, because I think that's going to be the core audience of who's listening to this, what do you feel, or from the feedback at least that you've been able to gather, what is the one that most people struggle with?
Not giving away their power. So this one is really about saying it's up to me to decide what kind of day I'm gonna have. You don't have the power to ruin my day, waste my time, steal my energy, to make me feel bad about myself. You can't make me mad. And when people take back their power, at first it's difficult because it's really about I'm taking responsibility. I can no longer say my boss is ruining my life. I'm going to take responsibility for that. Or I can't say my sister picks on me and makes me feel bad. I'm going to say that's on me to set a boundary. And so that's
Mhm.
difficult. If we've been doing that for a long time, we kind of want to blame other people for making our lives bad. So it means no, the responsibility is back on you. But when people do it, they'll say, "Yeah, boy." Like, just knowing that I have the option, I can end a conversation, I can speak up, I can set a boundary with somebody, I can decide to walk away, I can set limits, and I can manage my own emotions. It's not up to me to say, if somebody's having a bad day, it's not gonna rub off on me. I can still choose to have a good day. And that can be one of the most empowering things, but I find even if I'm speaking to a group, I was speaking to a group of people who are like high-ranking government officials, a lot of them appointed directly by the president. And afterward, and they were all wearing suits, very serious group of people. And afterward, one of them comes up to me and he says, I've been giving away my power to my mother-in-law for a very long time.
Mm.
And the thought that here you have this person who's very powerful in terms of their position and their employment, and they're making these really important decisions. And yet he said, I've been letting my mother-in-law like rule our house. She comes in and tells us what to do about the kids, and it leads to arguments with my wife. And for him, that was one of those moments of, yeah, no, I can take back my power in my personal life too. And sometimes there are just those people that we let get to us, or there are circumstances maybe that just presses one of those hot button issues for us. And 3 days later, you're still thinking about that conversation, or a week later, you're wishing you had done things differently, or you're dreading something coming up, and that those things can really eat away at your time and your mental energy if you're not careful and you don't say, I'm going to empower myself to say, I'm going to take back this mental real estate, or I'm going to take back my time, and here's how I'd much rather spend it. Instead of coming home from work and talking about the 3 negative people at work, what if you talked about the one positive experience? Or instead of complaining to people about something that they can't even fix, what if you talked about much more positive things? And there's this belief that venting is good for us, or that complaining is somehow helpful, or you have to get out all of those feelings. But the research is quite the opposite. If you're just complaining to people for the sake of complaining, it adds fuel to the fire. And it really gives those people more room in your life than perhaps you want to. And we're just giving them our energy. What if you spent all that energy and time on much more positive things? And that's what taking back your power is really about.
Yeah, it's wherever you give your attention. My sister told me that when I was in like middle school, high school, and so like hearing that, I would always be like, yeah, of course. Like I guess it's up to me, but at the same time, we want to believe it, but we don't want to admit to it. We don't want to accept it. We don't want to believe that we have the ability to change the way we feel about a thing or give agency to. And I believe I have such great boundaries in my life because of that, and being able to take ownership of that, I think, is really difficult. And there's so many tools that you've learned, and my sister has taught me as well, that you learn becoming a psychotherapist. And I'm curious, what other tools do you feel like we should have been taught that's similar to that?
Yeah, I guess another one along the same lines is that we have ability to manage our emotions, right? Like we don't really get
Mhm.
taught like what do you do with an uncomfortable feeling? Your parents might say don't hit your brother or don't raise your voice, but they don't teach you what to do instead. Whether that means
Yeah.
you're going to color a picture or go for a walk outside. But the two strategies that help us manage our emotions are changing the way you think and changing the way you behave. So sometimes it's just
Mhm.
about talking ourselves down. When you're worried about something that might happen next week and you just keep ruminating on all the worst case scenarios, just saying no, like I'm going to distract myself for a few minutes and go do something else. Think about anything differently, enough that your emotions come back down and you can then think a little more clearly. Or you do something differently. So if I had a bad day yesterday and today I keep replaying how awful it was and I'm still struggling with that today, sitting around and replaying that in my head isn't good for me. So I should probably get up and go running, or I could go meet up with a friend and talk about something completely different, but it's about changing my behavior. And that could shift my emotional state too. And but nobody warns us like, "Hey, when you are sad, you're gonna probably listen to sad music and sit on the couch and do all the things that reinforce sadness." Nobody tells us
Mhm.
that like, "Oh, you have to actually say being stuck in a sad mood, sometimes it's okay. Maybe you're honoring something that you lost last week and that's okay, but if you're staying stuck there for so long that you can't function, like obviously that's not healthy." But nobody warns us. If you want to turn your day around after a bad day at the office, don't come home and just listen to sad music and do things that reinforce your sadness. Do the opposite, that you can say, I'm going to create a list of mood boosters. This is an activity I do with a lot of my therapy clients. Make a list of 10 things you do when you are in a really good mood. Maybe you listen to happy music and you clean the house, you call a friend, you meet up and you have dinner, or you go outside and work in your garden. But what are 10 things you do when you feel really happy? Make a list of that and then keep that list handy, either on your phone or tape it to the refrigerator. When you're having a bad day, just do something from that list and you automatically boost your mood. You're not going to feel like listening to happy music and you might not feel like going outside and moving around, but do it anyway. And it will probably boost your mood at least a little bit. Maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, you're feeling like a 2. Do something on that list and you might at least get yourself up to a 4 or 5 to make the day a little bit better. And we have the power to do that. But yet, I think a lot of us grew up believing if you wake up on the wrong side of the bed or you have a bad day, you're kind of doomed to stay stuck in a dark place
Yeah.
until it magically shifts. But there's no magic shifting happen. It's up to you to make that change.
Yeah, we really have control of a lot of things that we are able to do. And most of the things that we don't feel like doing are the things that will make us feel better after we've done it. I'm glad that you brought up sadness, because I think sadness and self pity are two different things. Resilience and mental strength are two different things. And language seems to play a big role, but we don't really think about what we're saying. We just say things. But it also has an impact on the actions that we take and how we feel about things as well. How much of a role does language play?
It's huge. And I think it's important to pay attention to the language you use, even inside our own minds. The things that we
Hmm.
think. If I think, "Oh, I'm an idiot," like, that impacts how I'm gonna behave, or if I walk into a presentation and my goal is like, I just don't want to embarrass myself." Research shows I'll perform much differently than if I walked into that presentation thinking, "I'm gonna knock this out of the park and do my best." It affects how we feel, it affects how we behave, and there's an experiment I do, and sometimes I'll do this on stage if I'm giving a speech, but if I have somebody come up on stage and they hold their arm out to their side and I'll say, "Don't let me push down on your arm." And of course, you can hold your arm out and somebody can push down and it's pretty easy to resist. And then I'll say, "Now say out loud 10 times, 'I'm a weak and worthless person.'" So they do that. "I'm a weak and worthless person." We count. I say, "Now hold your arm out to the side and don't let me push down." You can push down on their arm, no problem. And then I'll say, well, now say out loud 10 times, I'm a strong and worthwhile person. So they do that. We do it again. Put your arm out and don't let me push down. And suddenly they can't push down. They can't, they can resist me pushing down again. And you think, well, what's the difference? How come like 30 seconds ago, you said a phrase 10 times and suddenly I can push you around physically? I can push your arm down. But when you say a different phrase about being strong, I can't push your arm down anymore. Like that is how powerful our words are. Even I gave them that phrase. That wasn't even necessarily something they believed, but just saying that out loud, their body believed their words. And I wish we were taught that as kids because we were taught, like, names will never hurt you. But like that's not true. It's not even the other people calling us names. It's the words that we use inside our own heads that affect our physical abilities, it affects our performance, it affects the way that we interact with other people, right down to the exact phrase and sometimes the subtle little things we say. Another strong example of that is how we speak to little girls versus how we speak to little boys. So we
Mhm.
know that 4-year-old little girls and 4-year-old little boys have about the same amount of confidence on average. But when they run that test again by about age 7, there's a huge shift. Almost all the little girls and all the little boys think that little boys are better at a lot of things. And one of the things we know is when adults praise little girls, they call them things like pretty. And we say to them that they're perfect. With little boys, we say, "Oh, you're creative. That's genius. You're really brave." And we encourage them to try, and if they fail, that's okay. But we give little girls the message that they should be pretty, and that if they're going to do something, it better be perfect. And you think, wow, by age 7, that subtle. I mean, again, words like calling somebody pretty and perfect, it doesn't sound like an insult. It doesn't sound like it would be a bad thing, but it affects their confidence right down to the core. So that's why I think it's so important to just take a look at language and how the words we use to other people are powerful, but also the ones we use inside our own heads.
Absolutely. 1000%. And those examples are really powerful because I don't think it's really, again, it's not talked about, it's not put enough emphasis on. And I don't know many people that have good self-talk. So I mean, it's a
Right.
problem for most people, right? I mean, I think most people struggle with it. One of the things that I think a lot of people say that I've eliminated out of my vocabulary is the word should, because I replace it with shame. I mean, I think that's pretty much all it is because we're just looking at what it could have been or what it could be, and it just hurts you even more. Is there language or words that you make sure that when clients say it, you kind of catch them before they continue on, or like words that you just aren't in your vocabulary?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when people just it goes back to being not good enough, right? And so people are like, "Ah,
Yeah.
I can't do that because," and I think, "Well, why? Why can't you do that?" "Well, because if I did, I'd embarrass myself." "Well, then what would happen?" "Well, then people would think I wasn't good enough." So sometimes it's about just taking back the layers of the onion to say, are there things that are going on that really point back to those ideas that you feel like you're not good enough? And a lot of the black and white thinking too, when somebody says everything, I'm either great at this or horrible at it. So we'll
Yeah.
dissect that because that kind of language really contributes to those ideas too of uh, like what would happen if you tried and you were mediocre at it? Would that be so bad? So I think on a case by case basis, just peeling back like the thinking errors that a lot of us have, the irrational thoughts about I can't do something, I'm not good enough to do it, and helping people recognize that, yeah. And then it goes back to that other one of the language when people say, like, so and so made me feel that way, or I have
Mm,
to, or I can't. Like, there's not many things in life you have to do. And you can
yeah.
choose to do them. And there might be a consequence if you don't, but it's a
Exactly.
choice. So I think just recognizing all of those things is really incredibly powerful.
Yeah, we live in too many absolutes. The black and
Right.
white thinking, the all or nothing. Like most things aren't absolute, but when we speak it out as though it is, then we give ourselves no other option mentally. But then
Right.
it actually happens in real life, not really even knowing that our language contributed to that, which is profound to think about. Um, yeah, I think that's so powerful. One of the things when it comes to worrying, for example, I've heard you speak about is like entertaining the opposite. That's as well when it comes to like thinking and how our thinking hurts us. Because when something bad happens, we automatically see it. That's already my language is it's bad, so that is it's going to be worse. Um, do you mind diving into entertaining the opposite? Because I think for so
Y-
many people, that's so powerful.
Right. Because our brain will go to the worst case scenario. And part of that is Maybe we were blindsided before. Like we thought
Mhm.
somebody was a great person and then they did something that made us think, oh, they weren't who I thought that they were. So then the time we meet somebody else, our brain goes to the worst case scenario. They don't call us back and we're like, yep, they're going to ghost me too. Or back to that example of you get an email from the boss that says, let's meet up. You're automatically thinking, I'm about to get fired. That's because your brain wants to protect you. It doesn't want you to walk into the meeting and get blindsided. It wants you to be prepared. So it makes sense that we think that. But that's only one option. Yes, maybe this person is ghosting you, but maybe they're busy. Maybe they just haven't checked their messages yet. Maybe they have something going on in their personal life, so they haven't been able to get back to you. So sometimes it's helpful just to remind yourself, like, well, what's the best case scenario? All right, my boss wants to meet with me tomorrow. Maybe I'm getting promoted. Maybe I'm getting a huge raise. Maybe something amazing is going to happen and there's new opportunity that I don't even know about yet. And while your brain might be like, well, that's kind of far fetched, why is that more far fetched than the fact that you're going to get fired? And the goal isn't to then walk into the meeting like expecting a $1 million raise tomorrow, but just to be open to the idea that there could be a million different reasons why your boss invited you to come in. And you don't have to spend the next 24 hours 100% believing that you're going to lose your job. Or if somebody doesn't get back to you right away, you don't have to believe that they have ghosted you and your whole relationship was fake or anything like that. Instead, again, maybe they're just busy or they're going to call you tomorrow. And when we're open to more possibilities, it just really helps our brain see that our first thought or our first assumption isn't always the right one. We don't have to believe it, but we can be more open-minded even with ourselves to know there are a lot of different possibilities. So sometimes I'll encourage people to do that. Somebody has something coming up in 3 months and they're really dreading it because they're imagining something horrible is going to happen. We'll say, well, what's the best case scenario? And we call it arguing the opposite. Like, let's argue just for a minute that maybe
Mhm.
something great's going to happen. And this works with stuff from the past too, because somebody will sometimes say, like, I said something in a meeting last week and I think I've ruined everything. And then we'll say, well, what's the opposite of that? Well, maybe you said something and literally nobody noticed, or maybe a couple people actually thought it was kind of wise what you said, or a couple people could relate to it, or maybe somebody could then thought, hey, this is somebody I could be friends with because they said something kind of sarcastic and that's the way they think too. A lot of different options, but if you don't run through the other scenarios, you're doing yourself a disservice. So sometimes just imagining what's the best case scenario can be helpful too.
Yeah, we have to stop taking things as face value, and that's essentially whatever that first thought is. It's what we take, but the curiosity to be open is something that is really, I think, is just such the most powerful thing that we can do when it comes to our, especially our thoughts. Um, One of the things that I love about your work is instead of looking at things to add, you think of things that we need to subtract. And I think it's very similar to why I made this podcast was I love the idea of beliefs and we need to learn a lot of things, but I like the angle of unlearning as well. So I'm curious for you, when you first wrote your first book, it was a lot of like the things that people shouldn't do. And a lot of that comes down to habits, I think. So what habit have you had the hardest time letting go of?
Oh, good question. So I would say might be the not giving away my power, even though that's one that I talk about all the time. I still have those moments of thinking, like, I couldn't do that because of XYZ, or it's easy to blame an editor or publisher or somebody else for making. If I get up to give a speech, like, oh, if only they had made the audio quality better, or if the lighting on the stage had been better. And you think, nope, my job is to do the best with the hand that I was dealt. And yeah, maybe things could have been better, but that's okay. And then my job is to just keep doing my best no matter what. So I think it's a constant reminder of that. And then how do I take more responsibility? So if the lighting wasn't great on the stage, maybe next time I take that factor into mind and ask beforehand. It's a learning process, and to always just be open to learning more and then taking that information and doing better next time.
Yeah. One of the things I've heard you speak on is how resilience is different than mental strength. And I think a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about what mental strength is to begin with. And we could have started here, but I'd love for you to dive into like what even for people to understand what mental strength is. Can you give a basis of how you explain it, how you see it?
Yeah, so mental strength is really about the way you think, the way you feel, and the way you behave so that you can reach your greatest potential in life. When people talk about resilience, they're usually talking about bouncing back. When something horrible
Mhm.
happens, you get right back up and keep going. And, like, that's great, but, like, I think it would be awful if we lived our entire lives, like, I'm gonna build up all this incredible resilience so that when the next tragedy happens, I'm prepared. I actually think that's a horrible way to live our lives. Like, I think we need the skills and tools to live when life is good too, because a lot of people are uncomfortable with being happy, or a lot of people struggle to accept the good things in their life because they don't feel like they're deserving. So mental strength's about that, about uncovering those unhealthy beliefs, changing our habits. Sometimes it's about making those small little changes so that we can be our best selves when life is good, or also when it's we're going through a really tough time. Obviously, life's going to throw us a lot of curveballs, but I don't think we should just wait holding our breath for the next curveball to come. I want people to enjoy the good days too, and to just feel like they're fully alive, that they're able to live according to their values, and that they're living the life that they are really proud to do, and that they feel like they are living their greatest potential.
Yeah. I think it's the living according to values. I don't think a lot of people think about the values that they have. They don't go through life thinking like these are my core values that are just non-negotiable for me. Do you have non-negotiable values that you live by?
I do. So, giving back to the community has always been something that's super important to me, and doing something that is of service and feeling like I'm making a contribution. And so I try to, when we talk about values, and I do this in my own life, is just thinking ahead. When I'm 100 years old,
Mhm.
if I get to live to be 100 and I look back on my life, like, how will I have wanted to have spent my time?
Yeah.
And where would I wish that I had put more energy, perhaps? And what kinds of things would I be proud of? And just in knowing that so much of what we do, unfortunately, isn't going to make a huge difference, like the kind of car you drive or whether you lived
Yeah.
on a sailboat may not matter to the next generation. But, like, what could I do to make a contribution that would matter? And are there things I could do that would at least make the world a bit of a better place now than when I got here? And looking for those opportunities. And I think then it's easier to make a lot of decisions in life. The
Yes.
things that are the tougher decisions become a little more crystal clear when you know what your values are. And a lot of people don't talk about values, or sometimes people feel kind of guilty about their values. Like,
Mhm.
well, I kind of do value, like, education a lot more than I am proud to admit, because maybe people around me don't. Or maybe I do value money, but maybe that's because I like money, because then I can help more people. And when I give talks to parents and kids, I'll do this experiment where sometimes I speak to the kids during the school day, and I'll ask them, like, would your parents be more proud if your teacher said you were the smartest kid in the class or the kindest kid in the class? And almost all
Mm.
the kids will be like, well, my mom wants me to be the smartest kid in the class.
Smart.
And then in
Yeah.
the evening, I speak to the parents and I ask them that same question. And then I encourage them to go home and ask their kids what their kids' take on that was. Because a lot of the parents will say, no, I want the kindest kid. And some parents will
Right.
say, I want both. I want my kid to be the kindest and the smartest. But it's like, well, then go home and ask your kid and just see what their answer is. And for parents who said, I really value kindness, well, then we'll talk about that. How much in your family do you talk about, were you kind to somebody today? Versus how much do we ask them, did you get your science homework done today? And it's so much easier to fall into that trap and we forget. But if you know, all right, we value kindness. So maybe if your friend calls, even if you're in the middle of your homework, maybe it's okay to take a break from your homework if your friend's upset and needs to talk about something, because we value kindness in this house. But having those conversations with kids is so important. But even as adults, sometimes stepping back and saying,
Mhm.
am I getting caught up in you know, all the competition of life? Am I trying to compete with people on social media? And really losing sight of what's valuable to me, because that's so easy to do sometimes.
It is extremely easy to do, and most of the time we're not really thinking about doing it. And I think something that I've been entertaining a lot more is that we get to choose what we define as success or what we give value and meaning to. And it's unfortunate that in this society and because of social media, what we see is what we feel we're supposed to want, but we get to choose what we want. And how has that changed for you as you've written more books and you've had one of the most successful TED Talks in the world? Like, how has your idea of what success looks like changed?
Yeah, I think once upon a time I would have thought, like, oh, if you have a book that hits the bestseller list, that means you're a successful author. And now I'm
Yeah.
like, does it really? Like, I hit the bestseller list and that was amazing, but that wasn't exactly earth shattering. But having somebody in a different country, my book's in like 40 something languages. And when I have somebody from a
So
different
cool.
country who says, Amy, we don't talk about mental health in my country, and I found your book incredibly helpful. or I'm not in a place where I could seek therapy because there's still such a stigma over here. But when I read your book, I learned things I didn't know. Like, to me, that is far more valuable than anything else. Or when I have my kid's book, when I have a kid who sends me a picture and says, I really liked your book. I had one kid that loved it so much, he used his allowance money to buy books for like all the other kids in his class because he said, my friends need this book too. So the thought of like a kid who does that to make sure that his friends have the book too, I think, well, that is like where the real value is. And that's not something you'll see on social media in terms of those little impacts that we can have on the world. But yeah, instead we see the flashy cars and stacks of money and the cool vacations people go on and the perfect bodies and all of that. And it's so easy to think, oh yeah, you have to do all of those things to keep up with people these days. But you definitely don't have to.
Yeah, it's just like we get to choose what thought we entertain. We get to choose what we desire, what we see as success. And I think it's when we see so many things where we feel as though that's what we're supposed to want, but choosing is a choice that we have. One thing that I love that you spoke about, and in a recent podcast I listened to, is that you solve the problem or you solve how you feel about the problem. And I'm curious from a therapist standpoint, how much does the problem have to do with the story that we tell ourselves about the problem? Like how far does that go? And that's a weird way of asking that, but
It's a great question because so many people could face the exact same problem and then tackle it so differently. So somebody who says my rent rate went up really high this year and I can't afford it. You have somebody who then sits and wallows and says, I'm going to wait to be evicted and then I'm going to be homeless on the street. You have somebody else who says, I've got this thing on my vision board and I'm pretty sure I'm going to find some money somewhere. And somebody else is like, I've been meditating a lot to take care of my emotions. And then you have somebody else who says, I went and picked up a job. I'm now an Uber driver in my spare time so I can afford my rent. And they move forward. Well, that wasn't somebody who then focused so much on the emotional toll of dealing with a hiked rent. They just said, I'm going to solve the problem. And a lot of people come to therapy like talking about what they're doing to manage their emotions. And that's part of what we do in therapy, but sometimes it's about tackling that problem head on. If your bills are stacking up there, like you can do all the meditation in the world and your bills aren't going to go anywhere. You need to solve the
right.
problem. And people are really sometimes like surprised by like, oh yeah, I could actually go out and just like tackle this thing head on. And I think that's one of the problems with the self-help industry these days is we tell people that, you should be doing more of all of these other things and de-stressing and you should feel better. But sometimes you have to change your environment if you want things to get better. But again, it goes back to you have to have a belief that, yes, I could do this. I could bring in some extra income and solve this problem. Because otherwise, if you think, nope, there's no other jobs in my community, nope, there's nothing I could do about it, I don't have any skills, I'm too tired already, then you do have a real problem. And maybe the solution then is you're going to look for someplace with cheaper rent or you're going to move in with your grandmother, but you have a million options. And that's part of depression too, is depression. People with poorer problem solving skills are more likely to develop depression, and depression also clouds our judgment and makes it more difficult to solve problems. So this is another thing I wish we taught in schools is problem solving skills. How do you solve a problem? There are always multiple ways to solve a problem, yet in our heads, we tend to think there's just one option. And if that option doesn't work, then there's nothing we can do about it. But with kids in my therapy office, sometimes I'll give them a challenge, like move this object from one side of the room to the other, but you can't touch it with your hands. And they'll look at me like, you can't do that. But within about 10 seconds, they'll come up with a list and we just brainstorm a list of here's at least 10 ways you could move that object without touching it with your hands. And kids come up with the most amazing things. One kid's like, well, I can't touch it, but you can touch it, so I'll just have you move it. Oh, okay, that's a great solution. But then if I do the same thing with adults, they'll often be like, I don't know, I don't think you can do that. And it's like the creativity is gone. But there's so many ways we can creatively solve problems if we're just open to brainstorming. And before we dive in and take action, sometimes it's about stepping back and saying, what are a few different ways I could do this? And even if they're far-fetched ideas, just think about it for a few minutes and say, all right, well, that's one option. I probably won't use it, but I could do that if I wanted to.
Yeah, it's crazy how much we lose from childhood to when we grow up. We lose our I feel like a lot of people lose their optimism as they get older because
Yeah.
they see life through a narrow perspective. Do you notice that?
Yeah, I think a series of hurts in life sometimes can make us,
Yeah.
again, it goes back to like, oh, I don't want to be blindsided, or I don't want to sit around with my rose colored glasses on. I want to be ready. And a lot of people will say to me, like, as long as I expect the worst, then I won't be disappointed. And they're really just trying to guard
Mm,
themselves from experiencing disappointment. So they expect
right.
things to be
Yeah.
awful. But what they don't realize is when you expect things to be awful, again, you might make that happen. You might make it so.
Yeah. The confirmation bias, we lean towards either what we don't want or what we want, whatever we're focused on, we're going to lean towards it. One of the things that I love asking questions that I often ask myself is, what's the cost of not taking action? Instead of taking action, we often fear what's going to happen if we do this thing. But living according to my values, I think to the end of my life as well, where it's like, well, I'm going to regret more so. I'm going to regret doing the things that I didn't do rather than the things that I did do and I failed at. So that's a question I often ask myself. Are there questions that you keep at the top of your mind to kind of keep you in line with living in your values?
Oh, I love that question, by the way, because we know that we often do it just the other way, like, the pros and cons of taking
Yeah.
this new job. But what are the pros and cons of not taking that opportunity as well? And knowing, like, in 5 years from now, and I guess a question I ask myself that is like, all right, in 5 years from now, how much will this matter? And the things that
Mm,
I worry about today, most of the answers are like, no, it's not really going to matter that much in 5 years. And then sometimes I just ask myself too, like, well, what's actually the worst thing that could happen? I embarrass myself, it doesn't work out. Well, then so what? And I figure if I'll either succeed at what I want to do, or I'm going to end up with a good story. And that's okay. If I just end up with a good
yes.
story of, hey, I tried this thing and it didn't work out and here's why. Sometimes those are the funnest times too. So I try to
Mhm.
just keep that into perspective by, those little things. And growing up as somebody who really didn't talk that much, who didn't like to take any social risks at all. Now I just remember, like, well, I could live like that, but that'd be pretty boring. If I want to have more good stories in life, you got to put yourself out there, try more things. And now as an author, of course, I love a good story, so I can put myself out there, try things, and when they fail, it makes a great story.
Yeah, you were someone in school that you kind of had people speak up for you, and then you created one of the best TED Talks of all time, one of the most viewed TED Talks of all time as well. What was the thing that played the biggest role in you being able to change your belief around public speaking or just overcoming that fear? Because it seems most people have it, but for you to go from not even speaking in class to speaking on stage, what helped you close that gap?
Yeah, as a kid, I never spoke. In high school, my English teacher would have everybody read their essays, and she didn't even bother to ask if I wanted to read mine. She just said, Amy, give me your paper, I'll read it for you. And I went to a very small school, so I had grown up with the same kids in my class. I'd known them since we were in kindergarten. So, um, but I had friends and who weren't shy. In fact, I just had a friend, childhood friend that I visited with a few days ago, and at a restaurant she was like tempted to order for me because that's how we grew up as a kid, is she always spoke for me. And we were laughing about that, because it just was not my thing. Speaking up in even a meeting in front of people, just not my thing at all. But what really changed it for me was I gave the eulogy at my husband's funeral. And when he passed away, there was a couple stories that I wanted people to hear about him that only I knew. And the plan was for my father-in-law to read it at the funeral. And the next day, the day of his funeral, I said, I think I'm going to do it. And he said, are you sure? And I said, yeah, I think so. Like, I feel like I'll feel better in life if I was the one who did it. And like in that moment, I no longer cared if I looked stupid or if I stumbled over my words. Like, it wasn't about me. It was about making sure that the audience heard these couple of stories about him that really spoke to his character. And I think that shift was everything for me. From that day forward, it was no longer about if I walk up to somebody like, "Do I look stupid?" It was more about like, am I able to communicate with this person in a way that's effective and to get my point across, and does the person feel heard? And making that shift when I get up in front of an audience now, it's not like, "Oh dear, I hope I don't look like an idiot." It's, I hope the audience takes away these lessons on mental strength. And that's all it was that mental shift. And now, if anything good came out of losing, my mother, my husband, my father-in-law, it's like now the small things don't matter. Like a social risk in life, really not a big deal. I can put that into perspective. And if I were to trip on stage in front of people, I don't think it would really bother me. Like, like it would have once upon a time. I'd be okay with that. Like, it's okay to embarrass yourself. It's not the end of the world. So that's certainly been, I guess, a strange silver lining in all of this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's powerful. The things that happen in our life, again, they happen for us, or they happen to us, and it propelled you into a career that seemingly you love, and it's amazing, and you're impacting so many people. There's one last question I ask every guest, encapsulates really what I want to do with this podcast. My question to you is, what belief are you currently unlearning?
Oh, that's a good question. So I could say there are probably lots of them, but if I had to pick one, it would probably still be that I'm more capable and competent than I think I am, because I still have times where I think I can't do something, or I have rules. We all create rules for ourselves. Like, I'll be safe as long as I don't do this, or if I don't do that. So I think it's still about
Hmm.
stretching myself and knowing I won't know how far I can go until I try something. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. I'll try it again. So I'd say my biggest one is still just uncovering, like, what am I actually capable of doing? And that, I think the story I'm still tempted to tell myself sometimes is like, I had good luck. I wrote an article that went viral, and
Mm,
and that I was an overnight success. Well, I know that's not the real story. Like, a lot of people do things that go viral. Um, but I was able to write one book and then turn it into 6 books because people are interested, and it wasn't just one. It wasn't good luck. It's been a lot of hard work and effort and learning, and a lot of other things that have gone into it. So I guess that's probably the biggest one I'm still working on.
I love it. Amy, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. All of your links, of course, will be in the show notes, but is there anywhere you'd like to direct people?
My website's probably the best place, which is Amy Morin, LCSW, as in licensed clinical social worker.com.